Hello, everyone. Welcome to Global Compliance Panel's live webinar on equipment validation, tracking, calibration, and preventive maintenance. My name is Johnson, and I'm going to be a host for today's session. On behalf of the Global Compliance Panel team, I would like to thank you for being a part of today's event. Today's webinar will be presented by Jeff Kassoff. Mr. Kassoff, RAC, CQM, is the Director of Quality at Medivators, a leading manufacturer of endoscopy products. Among his responsibilities includes review of process and equipment validation. Prior to this, Jeff spent 13 years at LifeTech as the Director of Regulatory Affairs, where he was responsible for regulatory compliance of all aspects of the quality system, as well as oversight of the equipment tracking, calibration, and preventive maintenance program. Jeff received his Regulatory Affairs certification in 1996 and his Quality Management certification in 2013. We are honored to have such a distinguished person such as Mr. Kassoff with us to present today's webinar. Before we begin, I'd like to inform you of the program outlined for today's training session. This webinar is for 60 minutes duration. First, Jeff will take you through today's webinar, highlighting the areas that will be covered, and he would then share with you his presentation. We'd like to inform all participants once part of the teleconference have been placed on mute and will remain so until the Q&A begins towards the end of the webinar. It is for the purpose of avoiding discontinuity for allowing the presenter to speak clearly so that everyone present can take maximum benefit from this webinar. We also request all to hold back your questions until the Q&A window begins. 10 minutes of time will be allotted for the Q&A, during which your questions will be answered. If for any reason you get logged out of this training session or teleconference, please follow the same procedure to join in again. Now that we are all ready to start, I request Jeff to take it from here. Jeff?
Thank you very much for the introduction. Let me welcome everybody to this webinar. For those of you who have not attended webinars before, really think that the only detriment, the only downside you're going to see is that I can't see you and you can't see me. The way I like to address that I find is very effective is at the end of the webinar, certainly we'll have a Q&A session, but I have no problem with this turning into a discussion. If you have just a statement of fact as opposed to having to phrase it in the form of a question, so to speak, let's do that. If you have a hypothetical or an actual situation that you've come across, I'm more than willing to discuss it. As you can see, the title of today's webinar is pretty much all about equipment, let's call it. Validation, calibration, maintenance. So the way I like to address this is, as you can see from an outline perspective, I want to begin with validation. Now, as we cover all these topics, specifically validation, let me kind of offer an apology, so to speak, which is to say that you've probably seen online and in-person webinars and seminars that deal exclusively with the validation process. And these seminars and webinars can last up to multiple days. As you can see, we have an hour here. So while I can give you specific examples and ideas and suggestions, remember that this is kind of a cursory and very slightly detailed examination of all these characteristics. So having said that, we're going to begin with equipment validation. Then we'll cover calibration. Under calibration, I do want to mention using calibration standards. Many companies just, from a reflex perspective, send their equipment out to be calibrated. It's not necessary that you do that. We'll spend a little while talking about that. Remedial action for out of calibration equipment. You have a piece of equipment, it's out of calibration, what do you do? Then we'll talk about, spend a few minutes speaking about calibration or maintenance. Which one do you use and when do you use it? Then we'll cover up with equipment maintenance. When you talk about equipment validation, it's used for automated equipment. You can't really, we're talking about equipment validation here and not design validation. For equipment validation, it's used for a piece of automated equipment that you're going to try to verify. You're going to try to make sure that this piece of equipment makes product that works. There are 3 phases of this validation. The first phase is installation qualification, and we'll talk about each of these in a little bit of detail. operation qualification and performance. Is it installed? Does it operate, and to what extent? And can you repeatedly make product off of it? The question when it comes to installation qualification, it's really nothing more than, is this piece of equipment, this sealing machine or packaging machine or sonic welder, is this piece of equipment installed correctly? And what you're going to have to do to determine this is you're going to have to ask yourself some questions. You're going to have to establish some parameters. Specifically, what are the design features of this piece of equipment? Then you have to look at installation conditions. Are there any requirements for specific wiring? Does this piece of equipment need to be wired into your current system, or can it merely be plugged in? What kind of utilities or venting implications are there? From a utilities perspective, is it, what kind of voltage does it put out? From a venting perspective, is it something that releases exhaust, for example? And if it does, what venting implications are there, either from a general one or, more importantly, an OSHA perspective? So you want to evaluate the extent to which OSHA's involvement may be present with regard to your piece of equipment. Then the environmental conditions. I mentioned a sealing machine a few moments ago. This is a machine that's used to seal pouches. Well, this piece of equipment is more than likely going to be used in a controlled environment, or even more so a clean room. If in these cases, you need to make sure that this piece of equipment can be used in such a controlled environment or clean room. If you have, from an installation conditions perspective, a piece of equipment that gives out exhaust, you can't use that in your environmental conditions with regard to a clean room, render this piece of equipment unable to be used in that location. You also want to establish calibration, preventive maintenance, and cleaning schedules. Most of the time when you purchase a piece of equipment that you're going to use in your assembly process, in your manufacturing process, it comes with an operator's manual, which does contain calibration processes and frequencies, preventive maintenance, calibration and frequencies, and cleaning schedules, how often you have to clean maybe a platen or something like that. What type of safety features you use need to be established also. Are there any open areas? What about any sort of, even from a safety perspective, a user safety perspective? If there's a long cord, but you have this unit close to the wall, is there going to be 6 or 8 feet of cord that may drag on the ground and may present user safety implications? You also want to make sure that any supplier documentation, including prints and drawings, manuals, anything you receive from them, you've got to have that. Or in your IQ document, because this is all going to be documented, you're going to reference their location. Most of the time, the supplier documentation will reside with the production manager, for example, any sort of production management or supervisor. You want to make sure on your IQ document you reference the location of that documentation. All of these things, the design features, installation conditions, or environmental conditions, et cetera, will need to be documented on your IQ document. Any sort of software documentation, if there's software involved in the running of the equipment, more so is this software programmable by the user as opposed to having some sort of resident memory. And then a spare parts list. It's key to establish a spare parts list less from a regulatory compliance perspective and more from a business perspective, because you want to know what the parts are when they wear down. A good way to look at this is from looking at the PM, the preventive maintenance process supplied by the manufacturer of this piece of equipment. To determine what spare parts need to be maintained, have yourself at least one, if not multiple, of each on hand so that when they need to be replaced, you or the maintenance technician, who perhaps is an employee of the piece of the manufacturing equipment, can just fix it quickly to reduce your downtime. The conclusion of the installation qualification, because you want to make sure with your IQ, your OQ, we'll define those a little later, and PQ, everything has a conclusion to it. And the conclusion to the IQ is, yeah, I have accounted for every implication when it comes to how this piece of equipment is installed, and this equipment is installed properly. At the end of the PQ, we're going to have a sign-off document that contains all of the requirements of the IQ with signatures at the end. The departments or disciplines or cross-functional areas that you determine need to sign an IQ and OQ and a PQ can be different between the three of those. But you've got to make sure that your procedure, your standard operating procedure that is, specifies which functions, which areas need to sign the conclusions for each of these. I've been cited by notified bodies specifically when I don't account for this, because if a notified body or other auditor or inspector sees inconsistencies between processes, they're going to ask to see the governing document. And when your governing document is not clear, you will be cited for that from a compliance perspective. The OQ, the operation qualification, establishes the process control limits. Not just the process control limits, which are ordinarily referred to as the cliffs, but it also establishes the action levels. So, for example, looking at something as simple as pressure when it comes, or temperature, excuse me, when it comes to something like a sealing machine. We'll talk about, we'll use sealing machine as an example, actually. You want to make sure that you set the temperature to the lowest possible temperature. You've got to know the lowest possible temperature that the pouch can seal at. Similarly, you've got to know the highest possible temperature that will not result in a burnt seal. So you have to look at the process control limits. And what many firms do is they take the advantage during this OQ to not just look at the absolute cliffs, but to bring it in some percent to have action levels. So they can proactively determine, well, I'm going to SPC these temperatures, and I've determined that even though my high temperature limit is, let's say, 170 degrees, I'm going to set my action limit at 160 degrees. So I know that I've got to take action when it goes above 160 degrees, because when it hits 170, I'm out of my validation requirements, and then I have to reactively fix my piece of equipment. The process for the OQ is obviously to know the pass-fail criteria for the product or process. We'll talk a little more about the sealing machine, but on the low end, the pass-fail criteria for a sealed pouch is that it's not sealed. You get below a certain temperature, for example, and that pouch is not sealed. The high end of the pass-fail criteria is that the pouch can't be burnt or have an otherwise less than perfect physical appearance, a cosmetic appearance. You also want to determine your process parameters. I've been using temperature exclusively throughout the discussion to this point, because there are other process parameters that deal with a sealing machine. There's dwell time, which is the amount of time the pouch travels through those jaws that provide the heat. And there's pressure. There's an amount of pressure that the pouch has to be subject to. If you look at any piece of manufacturing equipment, I don't like to speak in absolutes. The overwhelming majority of process equipment or even test or inspection equipment has multiple parameters. You've got to make sure when you perform your OQ to take all of those process parameters into account, because you're going to manipulate each of those to develop your cliffs, your high and low cliffs. You want to manipulate each parameter, as I mentioned, pressure, temperature, and dwell time with regard to a sealing machine, that is, and all parameters simultaneously. Your goal during the OQ is to determine the nominal setting of each parameter, which is to say, I have this particular pouch, again, using the sealing machine. I've given this webinar and actually in-person seminars quite a few times, and sometimes I speak about a little more complex pieces of equipment that have many more parameters. And, for example, sonic welding or something like that, automatic PC board assemblies. But I find that the overwhelming majority of people who attend my webinars and seminars can understand and comprehend the, simplicity of the sealing machine. So that's usually the piece of equipment that I do reference for this ease of reference, that is. So you want to develop your goal during the OQs to determine the nominal setting for each parameter, which is to say, this particular sealing machine on this particular pouch is to be set at what temperature, what pressure, what dwell time. Because what happens quite often is that your firm may not make enough product on that one sealing of that particular product using that sealing machine. So you may use multiple pouches on the same sealing machine. So the process that you're going to validate is, let's call it small pouch, which has its own nominal settings that are different than big pouch. You also want to determine the allowable tolerance of each parameter, because even though you set at 100 degrees, it could drift a little. It could also be that, so you want to make sure that when you set it at 100 and the temperature reads 101, 98, 103, for example, that you're within your tolerance, because not just the visible tolerances, but if you neglect to calibrate your temperature reader, for example, you want to make sure that you're within a reasonable tolerance. The way to do this, the method by which you're going to perform your OQ is, as I mentioned a moment ago, the highest and lowest settings at each parameter, at which each parameter produces product that fails, that does not meet all defined requirements. Because I can take my temperature all the way from, let's say, a nominal of 100 all the way down to 90, 80, 70, 60. If 60 degrees produces good product, I know that, and that's helpful, but I don't know whether 59 produces bad product. So you want to make sure that when you perform your OQ, you reject product on a particular parameter or parameters. And your other goal here is to establish nominal settings to set as operational parameters to the PQ. Your OQ is going to be a lot of hunting, a lot of experimentation and setting parameters that result in product that fails or doesn't fail, and then adjusting those parameters. But at the end of your OQ, you're going to have nominal settings, because when you perform your PQ, which is actual product at nominal settings, you want to make sure that you have those nominal settings and you have built-in allowable tolerances. Here's an example of a sealing machine OQ. Again, kind of cursory here, but for a simple example of a sealing machine, here's my pass-fail criteria. A certain amount of peel test strength, and my seals have to look good. Obviously, it says nice appearance here, but I'm going to have perhaps visual acceptance criteria that I include as part of this protocol. I have a single parameter for the purposes of this simple example. Again, this is a very simple example here. And my only parameter is temperature. So I'm going to manipulate this parameter. And the way I'm going to develop this parameter, where do you start is the first question. If you have any experience with similar, let's say, sealing machines, you're going to start at that temperature. Also, when it comes to literature, maybe there's some literature out there, on the net, or maybe there's something written in the operator's manual that gives you a good starting point. A good way to do this also is, if you can't find anything, contact the supplier of that particular equipment to have them help you determine. Sometimes they'll be a little bit helpful. They'll give you, in this case, a particular temperature that they've just anecdotally heard from their customers. That's great. Anywhere to start is where you want to start. You're going to end up hitting your high and low cliffs anyway, but if you can have a good starting point, it reduces the time of this OQ. If neither one is possible, if the supplier won't help you and you can't find any sort of literature and you have no experience, quite honestly, just start somewhere that seems reasonable. And you want to make sure that when you use tolerances, you make them measurable. So from a measurable perspective, while you may have the capability to measure in quarter degrees, a quarter of a degree, for example, that's not something that you want to do. You don't want to set your tolerances that tight to almost be immeasurable, so to speak. And what we do here is, since we've identified that one of our pass-fail criteria is a particular strength of peel test, we're going to peel test after each effort. We're going to make certain number of pouches at each temperature that we determine, and we're going to peel and peel and peel. And what we're going to have is we're going to have product that is not strong enough at the low end, and product that is burnt, that the temperature is so high that it burns the pouch. It looks blackened almost. So in practice, hypothetically, we have other sealing machines at this company, And so we know that we're going to seal pouches, empty pouches at 172 degrees. Just because I have something in my pouch doesn't mean the temperature is going to, that doesn't mean the seal appearance or seal strength will look different. It's a little bit naive to think that because I have my plastic accessory or 12-inch long tube set in this pouch that it's going to provide such a force that I'm not going to get accurate empty pouch sealings. So I go from 172 down to 157 at 5-degree increments, and you know, the seals were visually unacceptable. They were discolored, they were blackened. But going down to 152, the seals look good. Voila, I have my high setting at that point. Now I'm going to continue to lower the temperature. So I go 100 and I go down 10, and at 142, the preliminary low setting is determined because the seals were complete. What this OQ in practice eliminates, leaves out, not by design, I apologize, is going down to the temperature by which pouches fail and increasing that a bit. So continuing this, let's say that the empty pouches at 132 degrees did not seal. We're going to continue to increase that to 133 and 4 and 5 till we find a temperature at which the pouches do seal, and that's my minimum, minimum setting. So at the end of the OQ, much like the IQ, you're going to have a conclusion. And at this point, we're going to decide to begin production at the nominal plus and minus the tolerances that we had in place. Here's a more complex example. There's a packaging machine, which is different than a sealing machine, because while it still makes pouches, it does have multiple parameters. As I mentioned a moment ago, temperature, dwell time, and pressure are the 3 parameters. So you can manipulate, you're going to still manipulate each one, but you're going to manipulate all of them simultaneously. So as you can see, the parameter development is the same as, when you develop parameters, you develop parameters based on the piece of equipment you're using. Sealing machines and packaging machines are similar enough that the parameter development is identical. However, as you can see, in practice, the OQ itself is a little different. In this hypothetical, the supplier of the pouch material mentions specific ranges that he's heard anecdotally. So the sealing temperature is 127 plus or minus 3. The pressure is the 3 bar plus or minus 0.2, and the dwell time is 2 plus or minus 0.1. You run them at all the low settings, all the nominal settings, and all the high settings. And if all 3 production runs do not meet specifications, you're going to manipulate the parameters until they do. And if you need to mix the low, nominal, and high, or in many cases the low and the high, based on my experience with packaging machines, what happens is when you have, the best way to validate these things is to set it at the highest temperature that you think is going to produce non-conforming product, but the slowest dwell time. So when it's at 100, in this case, 130 degrees, but 2 seconds, it's seeing the most temperature over the longest period of time, the longest period of time. Similarly, I'm going to go the other way. I'm going to seal at 125 degrees at the shortest amount of time, because the chances are that it's going to see the least type of seal, the least complete seal. Generally speaking, the OQ document is going to have an objective, what you're trying to do, and the approved validation plan. You've got to make sure, I can't recommend more, that you have an approved validation plan, including a protocol, what equipment you're going to use to validate this piece of manufacturing equipment, what you're going to do, and your predetermined pass-fail criteria. As I mentioned earlier, the pass-fail criteria is critical. You've got to know what you need to see before you begin your actual testing. And the protocol itself will be signed off and approved before the conclusion. The results are gathered and the conclusion and summary are signed off. The reason why I have both a conclusion and a summary is based on my experience with FDA. What you find is when you deal with the FDA is that most inspectors, while they have a well-rounded background across the entire medical device or pharma communities, aren't really that technical. They don't have, when I say technical, I mean that while they may be microbiological experts, they don't have experience when it comes to specific pieces of manufacturing equipment or automated manufacturing processes. When you include a summary in your OQ and other technical documents as well, it enables the reviewer to look at that summary, which is written for a layperson, and understand it, and then it gives them a good starting point to go into the OQ, because they will go into the OQs that they review page by page and test by test. So it gives them an idea of what it is that they're seeing. Putting raw data in front of a reviewer, whether it's your notified body or FDA or OEM partner, is just asking for a lot of confusion. And your goal during internal, not so much internal, but external audits, whether it's a business partner or a federal agency, is to make the inspection last as short as possible. When you have a summary, the person reviewing it understands what they're looking for, which enables them to go look for that information. The PQ establishes that your process consistently produces a product. As you can see, the word consistently is here. It's not just underlined, it's italics, it's bold-faced. The way to prove, it's up to you to produce consistently. The implication of consistency is repeatability. If you make consumables or other types of commodity products, 3 consecutive production runs is the way to go. It's a generally accepted industry-wide requirement that Food and Drug Administrator, FDA inspectors will expect to see. If you make more equipment-based things, you're going to have to provide a statistical evaluation of why you only chose 1 or 3 or 6 units. 3 is the magic number, so to speak, but it still requires a statistical rationale for why you chose 3. What some firms choose to do in these situations is they look at sales figures, and they say that they've shown that they sell, let's use 5, for example, that they sell 20 units a month, which is 5 units a week. So they're going to validate a week's worth of product. So that's why they've chosen 5 units. So that you can justify statistical sampling using sales figures or production figures. There is, what we're going to talk about here is concurrent validation, during which the product produced that's validated, that's used in the PQ, is going to be used. So these 3 consecutive production runs, I'm going to make my normal production size of, let's say, 1,000 pieces. And based on the ANSI standard, I'm going to sample 80 pieces from each lot. Well, I've got 920 other pieces from each lot that I could conceivably use. The way I'm going to use these products is by lot release. Once the first lot finishes its validation, I'm going to test the 80 pieces. They will pass, hypothetically. And I can release those 920 pieces into stock if I have to. While concurrent validation is a thing, it is an actual practice, if you can avoid concurrent validation and use the more accurate validation of keeping all 3 lots in your MRB, mature review board, in your reject area, in your hold area, until release, that's always preferred. It's a little bit cleaner. The PQ itself, let me just say, this format should look familiar. The reason why is because consistency is the key. If you've seen that the OQ document is very similar to the PQ document, it enables your people in-house completing each document to be consistent, to know what to expect. The reviewers who review the validation plan as well as the validation results know where to look. And I would argue, most importantly, looking at the external reviewers, OEM partners, FDA notified body, they've seen this before. All of your OQ and PQ documents look the same. So similarly, you have your signed off validation plan and then your validation results document, including, as I mentioned earlier, the summary document for the reviewer. So let's say that you have a piece of equipment that you want to relocate. Your manufacturing facility moves, maybe you expand and you move your equipment across the street to a larger building. Even if it's merely across the room, you are taking your piece of equipment and you're moving it. You are rendering your IQ invalid now, because even though you've established your requirements in your IQ, you've got to reperform the IQ itself to establish that the installation is acceptable. So wherever you move it, across the room, down the hall, across the Atlantic, you need to take things into account. The IQ, you've got to reperform that. You're uninstalling and then reinstalling your piece of equipment. Well, looking at the OQ, when you performed your OQ, what you did was you determined your operational parameters, your high and your low cliffs. When the IQ shows that the equipment still operates in the same manner, that does not invalidate, it doesn't even impact your OQ itself. The parameters are still there. So we have a piece of equipment that's been reinstalled. We know what our cliffs are. Now we have to evaluate whether we want to do a PQ. The best way to determine this is to base it on risk. You have prepared if you're compliant with the ISO 14971 and or FDA regulations or ISO 1345, you have performed a risk assessment. I definitely recommend you use your risk assessment to determine whether a PQ is required. Now, it's not going to be required, but you want to look at it to evaluate whether you want to perform a PQ. Look at it equally from a compliance perspective as well as a business perspective. So what's the effect if the parameters are not met? Let's use the sealing and packaging machines. I'm not going to do a PQ, or I don't want to do one because I want to get this piece of equipment back to service as quickly as possible. What's the effect if my parameters are not met? So I might have discolored seals, but they're complete seals. So that's just a cosmetic thing that my end users might say these don't look good. Well, unfortunately, now let's look at the other end of my parameter. My parameter is that the seals are complete. If I'm offline, if something goes wrong here, and my pouches are not sealed, but my product is labeled sterile, that's a huge issue. So when it comes to a sealing machine or packaging machine, I would determine that based on the risk that we do perform a PQ. I've seen firms perform abbreviated PQs by saying this instrument has just been relocated a short distance. It was put on a truck at one location and taken off a truck at another location, and that the IQ addresses things. And however, to go over and above, they're going to perform an abbreviated PQ. Anecdotally, since I've never done this, my acquaintances in the industry have told me that what happens here is that the regulatory inspector asks a lot of questions. Well, I understand, what made you do an abbreviated PQ? And there's a lot of rationalization and justification that goes on. I'm not a fan of providing documented justifications. I would rather go the extra mile, do the testing, and in this case, testing that I did previously, and let the data speak for itself. Being data-driven is the way to go in this industry. While you can consider an abbreviated PQ, I recommend you do repeat the PQ that you performed. A validation master plan is a great document. It's an aid that helps you determine which equipment requires validation. In truth, it's really nothing but a big list. And on this list, a spreadsheet, let's say, or a database, you have name of the equipment, its manufacturer, its serial number, its location. Now, location is temporary at some point, but you have its location as far as what's officially logged in the records, how it's used, and its validation status. In our validation master plan, what we have is we have a test reference number for the IQ, OQ, and PQ, so we know that a particular piece of equipment has been validated. There is some equipment you have that does not require validation. We'll speak about that in a minute, in which case you're going to verify. So if you verify, you're going to have a verification method, how you verify on an ongoing basis that the output of that particular piece of equipment meets its requirements. Every piece of equipment will have either validation status or verification method. having said a moment ago that there is equipment that does not require validation, here's what you have to do. You have to make sure that the output of this equipment is fully verified in every case against specifications. That's an example of situations where validation is not required. And a good example is you have a Swiss machine, a mill, that makes metal pieces. And each one of these metal pieces is going to be inspected before it's used for deburring and smooth surfaces, let's say. That process does not need to be validated because I have explicit instructions for my assemblers, for example, that every time you're going to take this metal piece and assemble it in a product, you're to look at it. I don't need to validate that process because it is fully verifiable. Another example of times when validation isn't required is if you have a piece of equipment that's used very infrequently, or maybe you only make one piece at a time. If you have a piece of equipment, if you use equipment to make an operating table, for example, this equipment is used relatively infrequently. It's used all the time, but it's only used, you only make one piece per, let's say, week, for example. If so, you can do verification by output, and you explain how you're verifying that piece of equipment, whether it's fully verified or it's infrequent. Moving from validation to calibration, calibration is the situation by you want to make sure that any piece of equipment that you use to determine conformance to specification, it is accurate in its measurement. Something that's interesting is that many firms are really well aware of the need to include production and QA equipment in their calibration program, but some forget to include equipment used by R&D, research and development. They're developing your processes and your specifications. Because it's R&D that translates often customer requirements to physical and performance specifications in the early stages when they're doing design control. So you've got to make sure that all measurement and test equipment, independent of what department uses it, undergoes calibration. Also, things like ESD protective gear, whether it's the wrist straps or the placemats, those have to be in your calibration program as well. Anything that's used in manufacture, design, I mentioned already, anything that your servicing department uses has got to be under equipment calibration. An interesting question when it comes to determining calibration intervals or scheduling is how often is calibration required on a particular piece of equipment? Much of the time this is supplied by the equipment manufacturer. Usually default is about a year. That's usually where most people start, especially if the piece of equipment is not, the calibration interval is not specified by the equipment manufacturer. But it's okay to then further expand your interval. For example, if you have 5 consecutive years, you calibrate a particular piece of equipment once a year, and you have 5 consecutive years of no adjustment required, which means that it's always been in spec. You've never had to, it was never out of spec. You may look at expanding this interval from 1 every year to every other year, because what you don't want to do in this situation is, if you have 5 consecutive years, you don't want to expand it to every 5 years. You're not building yourself any leeway, any cushion there. But doing it every other year is definitely more than acceptable. When you schedule your calibration performances, make sure that your scheduling avoids complete absence of equipment. Now, it's going to be kind of difficult if you have one piece of tester calibration equipment. Maybe you have only one high pot tester, for example. They cost a couple of bucks. In those situations, you want to make sure that you have on-site calibration, because it makes it less of an issue. Actually, it makes it no issue, because the only downtime is when calibration is actually being performed. If you have calipers, for example, very cheap pieces of equipment, you've got to calibrate them. They have to be in your calibration system. If you have all of them due on the same day, because it's much easier that way, that doesn't work, because on a particular day, you're not going to have any left. Stagger these things. There's commercially available calibration programs out there that enable you to input data, input pieces of equipment, that is, and at the beginning of each month, it sends you a list of which particular pieces of equipment are due during that month. Even if you have a spreadsheet where you go in there at the end of each month and reactively look at what's due next month, that's okay too. But I've learned I've learned the hard way that you want to make sure that you always have something in-house that you need to use to enable production to go. Calibration standards are used very often by contract calibration services because there are a couple of external standards that are used here. There's the 17025, which is testing and calibration labs. There's the ANSI standard that is a general document. U.S. labs don't need to conform to international standards. Many of them do, just from a business competitive perspective, but they don't need to. Those of us who have been doing this for a while remember when the MIL standards were in vogue. And MIL Standard 120 was canceled forever ago, but I can guarantee you that you can find someone at your company who perhaps hasn't done calibration for a while. They'll think that this MIL standard is still in force. It was a great document because it had guidance, really a procedure, standardized procedure on how to calibrate calipers and gauges and mics and a bunch of other things. You can look at it just for fun. I've given you, here's the web citations to go look at this. It was very helpful. You may find it helpful also in developing your own internal procedures on how to calibrate calipers. I've been involved in usually notified body audits more than FDA inspections, where I've been asked, how do I calibrate my calipers? Fortunately, I have, at places I've been asked that, I've had specific documents in place that explain how I'm calibrating my calipers. If you send your calipers, for example, out, it's up to your calibration firm to provide you with instructions on how they calibrate, and most will. If you calibrate things in-house using physical calibration standards, then you're going to have to provide your own equipment. There are a couple of requirements when it comes to calibration. One is traceability of the calibration. You want to make sure that anything that's used is directly or indirectly traceable to external standards. If you send all of your items out to a calibration lab, that lab will use these standards themselves. If you send some items out and internally calibrate to them, that's a way to do it. Might be unclear. A good example is if you have scales that you calibrate in-house. You can purchase weight you can purchase weights, and you would take these weights and you would send them out to the calibration lab, and they would come back, and you would use those weights to internally calibrate your own scales. So that's a way to trace. You want to make sure that those weights are traceable when you send them out to be calibrated at the calibration lab, that those weights, the calibration of those weights are traceable to the NIST standard. And that way, your scales are indirectly traceable to the external standard. Take a look at a couple of pages that will give us some information. When you look at the limits of your accuracy and the limits of your precision, you want to make sure that you use the entire range of measurement of the item. You can't just use calipers, for example, and say, yeah, plus or minus a ½ inch, because if that caliper is used to measure quarter-inch tolerances, that's not enough. So you've got to look at the entire range of measurement of the item and then set your limits accurately. You know, a precision greater than the routine tolerance is usually the way to go. I've seen it between 3 to 1, 10 to 1, whichever you prefer, as long as you make sure that the precision is greater than the routine tolerance. Here's a admittedly hard to see, but not that difficult to see, sample certificate of calibration. It's from a company that I used to work at named LifeTech. Unfortunately, I believe they're no longer in business. But as you can see here, it references it's specific about a third of the way down. It says master reference standards are traceable to NIST, and it has the specific reference number, calibration date, and due date. So it references what the calibration is and references the external standards. The traceability here, if you look further on down, about 80% down, it references ISO 112, the ANSI Z540, the MIL standard 45662. There's all sorts of traceability here. This is what you get when you send items out to be calibrated. These firms do it professionally, and in many cases, it's worth it to just get it out of your way. Other times, this particular micrometer, for example, the previous slide was, this previous slide was gauge blocks. And what this micrometer is used for is it takes the gauge blocks on the previous slide and calibrates to them. This is a type of indirect traceability that I referred to previously. So it's very interesting to look at this as far as how you set. You can see here the parameter measured based on the as found in the tolerance and the final reading. So it sets forth here what the parameters that are going to be used. And then the second section where it says standards used in this calibration references the manufacturer, the model number, the serial number. So I can tie the standards used in this calibration to the actual standards that have been sent out to another firm. When you use calibration standards, they absolutely save cost. There are some limitations, though. You're going to use it to calibrate your own equipment. It's usually limited to mechanical equipment as opposed to electronic equipment. Most companies that are in the medical device or pharma industry lack the expertise to use external calibration standards to calibrate things electronically. And if you're within that limitation, you don't have to send equipment out to be calibrated. You send your standards out, but you're going to continue to use your in-house test measurement equipment in the meantime. Things like gauge blocks, squares, surface plates, weights. You make sure that your standards are calibrated every year. Even if you use those standards to calibrate one of your pieces of equipment that's only calibrated every other year, you definitely want to make sure that you send the standards out every 12 months. On your piece of equipment, you've got to identify that piece of equipment with a permanent serial number. I've seen some etched, I've seen stickers, however you want to use it, embossed tape is fine. This facilitates this identification of equipment if, and in some cases when, the calibration sticker actually falls off. So if you identify your piece of equipment in a permanent manner, it facilitates calibration. There are times where the calibration sticker comes off. It does happen. You need to account for that because the worst feeling is to be holding a piece of equipment in your hand that has no sticker and no identification. You also want to identify calibration status. It's usually on a sticker, and the label on the sticker, in addition to the calibration status, usually it's a green sticker I've seen, has date of calibration, calibration due date, and person who performed the calibration. Initials are fine. There's no need for a formal signature. You also want to make sure when it comes to calibration that the environmental conditions in which the calibration is performed are suitable. You don't want to calibrate it outside, for example. If it's used in a temperature-controlled location, you don't want to calibrate it in perhaps your warehouse that may not be temperature-controlled. And the requirement when it comes to handling and storage of calibration equipment, the regulation requires that it shall be such that accuracy and fitness for use are assured. You want to make sure that when you develop your calibration procedure, you reference this requirement in your procedure, and a way to address it is that all equipment is either put away when it's not used or it's put in its packaging when it's not used. It doesn't just sit on the table to potentially be knocked off and then placed back on the table without telling anybody. So that's how you address the handling or storage requirement. You want to make sure that you divide your equipment. You don't want to make sure, but a suggestion might be to divide it into electronic versus mechanical. You have electronic custom, which is built by your firm and tested against known verifiable standards. Perhaps you have like simulation devices that are used to simulate the clinical use of your product. Then you also have commercial available electronic things, oscilloscopes, particulate counters, electronic weigh scales, and things like that. Then mechanical custom are built by your firm and must be tested against known verifiable standards. Again, anything custom built by your firm to use in calibration has to be calibrated against something. In many cases, you won't have the known verifiable standards, So this might preclude you from using custom equipment in your to use in your firm. And mechanical, commercial, these are the most straightforward. These are the ones that, excuse me, you can calibrate in-house against the commercially available, against the standards, the calipers, the gauges, the rulers, excuse me, things like that. You've got to have documents that evidence the calibration. It's not just enough to have a sticker on your piece of equipment, but you've got to have, I've seen them called certificates of calibration in the past. And you've got to have that for each item that undergoes calibration. We saw an example of one earlier in the presentation. You also want to have an equipment log, because how else does your calibration tech know that particular piece of equipment are due for calibration at a particular time? So your calibration log, many people use databases or Excel spreadsheets or commercially available programs. Identify a piece of equipment by type, manufacturer, model, serial number, date of the last calibration. There's a lot of data points that need to be recorded to assure that you calibrate on schedule and the same way each time. You want to have any internal certificates of calibration that you prepare, you want to have someone review and approve them, someone who did not perform the calibration. It's a good internal check. In my experience, the FDA inspector realizes that the reason you're performing calibration in-house is, quite honestly, to save a few dollars. So even though you have external standards used and you have everything covered, a second set of eyes in an internal process that's normally outsourced is really usually a good idea. Something you've got to determine also is record retention. Who keeps these records? I recommend in your procedure reference by position. Most of us have a calibration tech, so that's pretty much a no-brainer. And if you distinguish, as I mentioned on an earlier slide, between electronic pieces of equipment and mechanical pieces of equipment, some firms choose to separate these. For example, they may have production engineering, manufacturing engineering, maintain the electronic records, the calibration records for electronic things, but may have quality engineering maintain them for mechanical. Most firms don't do this, but I know firms that do, so I definitely want to make sure to include this as part of this presentation. You're going to specify the frequency of how often your your equipment is calibrated. Definitely don't make it less frequent than the manufacturer recommendation unless you've been qualified. As I mentioned earlier with the example of no adjustment required over 5 years, yeah, we're going to go ahead and decrease that in frequency from every year to every other year. And here's an example that you've got to have, not just that it hasn't been adjusted for 5 years, of course you must have data verifying this. What many firms choose to do that I'm actually a big fan of is, as part of this justification, they have an engineer sign that based on the use of this piece of equipment and its history, it's okay to reduce the frequency to every other year. There are some things there are some things, specifically equipment in this case, that you need to make sure that from a risk-based assessment, the parameter is so critical that you don't want to decrease the frequency. That's why you want to have an engineer look not just at history, but also at risk associated with the problem of use. What do you do if you have a piece of equipment that is out of calibration? This out of calibration equipment, this remedial action, will encompass anything that required adjustment to be returned to acceptable operation, and equipment that can't be adjusted at all. This is just broken. The process is tag the item immediately and pull it out of use, and make sure when you remove it from use, you record this in your internal calibration database or spreadsheet. You want to document the specifics of the out of calibration condition. How far out of calibration was it? You want to forward this to a committee. It's very problematic when you have one person who oversees calibration, who tags the item, who determines the specifics, or in some cases just records something else that's been determined, and then determines the corrective action. This is really better suited for perhaps your non-conforming committee or your material review board. cross-functional teams that evaluate things like this are the best way to evaluate what corrective action or recommend and determine what corrective action should be taken. However, something you must do by regulation is to assess the validity, to look at any previous test or inspection data or measurement data that you've received using this piece of equipment that was shown to be out of calibration, even though it was able to be adjusted to be brought back into calibration, the measurements may have been wrong. So when you determine the specifics of the out of calibration condition, let's say it was 1/1,000,000th out of calibration. Well, you know what? Our tolerances are 1,000th. So the fact that it was 1,000,000th, it's okay. I have then therefore assessed the validity of the previous data and shown that it is acceptable. And all of this remedial action documentation should be maintained with the calibration record for this particular piece of equipment. Whether you maintain or calibrate depends on the use of the equipment. And the way I like to address this, the way I like to distinguish is if the piece of equipment determines conformance to specifications, you're going to calibrate that. If it's used to assist in assembly testing, you've seen a lot of, the phrase that's often out there is a manufacturing aid or tool or fixture. Fixtures are normally, and tools are normally maintained, but things that tell you whether or not a particular component, subassembly, or finished device is good, is according to specification. Those types of things are calibrated. There's a little bit of crossover. Sometimes items determining conformance to specifications also undergo maintenance in addition to calibration, but it's more rare that an item, a fixture, or an aid is maintained. So when it comes to maintenance requirements, there are distinctions between maintenance and calibration. Much of this is due to the fact that there are really no international standards for preventive maintenance. This is the downside of maintenance. The good side of maintenance is that, maintenance requirements are usually supplied by the equipment manufacturer. When you purchase a several, dozen, $1,000 piece of equipment, it comes with an operator's manual that usually has the recommended maintenance, including its frequency. So you can merely take that and fold that into your PM program, which is easily enough. Unlike calibration also, there's issues of frequency that have multiple frequencies. For the overwhelming majority of manufacturing equipment, it has monthly preventive maintenance. It has quarterly, which is monthly plus a few extra things. It has semi-annually, twice a year, which is quarterly, monthly, and other things that are merely semi-annual. So there's different levels of preventive maintenance that are required, and different parts, different sections of that piece of equipment are usually checked each time. When it comes to documentation, unlike calibration, there's really no centralized location because each item, normally in practice, each item has its own log, preventive maintenance log, that's located at each piece of equipment. I know that there are commercially available maintenance programs that preclude this requirement, but more often than not, the people who are using a piece of equipment or the people who are maintaining it want to see the history right there as they're maintaining it. They want to see the processes that they have to maintain at that moment, and then they also want to see the most recent time that they did that. So pulling everything together, and I know it was a lot, and a little more cursive than I'd like, but I hope that you got a lot out of this. IQ validation, when it comes to validation, the IQ is the equipment setup. Is the equipment set up acceptably? In the OQ, we're going to determine the worst case testing. We're going to take steps to show what parameters result in bad subassemblies or devices. The PQ assures repeatability of conformance of the nominal settings, and you've got to have approvals at each step. Calibration requires traceability, whether it's direct, in which case you send things out, or it's indirect, in which you use standards that are sent out directly. And if you have remedial action, if you've got to bring something into calibration because it wasn't, you've got to evaluate the measurements that were made during that period of time during which the piece of equipment may have been out of calibration. Normally speaking, If the item determines conformance specifications, you're going to calibrate. If it's used as an aid in manufacturing, you're going to use maintenance. As I said, there are definitely times where you maintain items that are calibrated. And equipment maintenance is, a little more than calibration to some extent, because each piece of equipment has multiple procedures and multiple frequencies within each of those procedures. So I guess we can look at the Q&A. You can take some Q&A right now, and moderator, please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Mr. Gasser, for the wonderful presentation. Well, I also want to thank all our participants for cooperating with us. Ladies and gentlemen, it's time for the Q&A to begin. We request all who have questions for our presenter to click on the raise hand option, which is a palm-like icon at the bottom of your participants panel, to ask your questions verbally. Or you can also go ahead and post your questions on the Q&A panel so that our presenter can read it out loud and then answer. For any reason, if you are unable to ask your questions using either of these two means, please feel free to share it with me via chat, and I shall pass it on to our presenter to have them answered. Meanwhile, we sincerely request you to share your feedback with us. The feedback form has about 8 questions. It will appear on your polling panel right now, and wouldn't take more than 2 minutes of your time to answer. The feedback form will be available till the end of the session. Yes, Jeff, I do see a question which has come up on my chat panel. I'm just passing that on to you.
Okay.
Yes, you should have the question now.
Okay, the question is, can you define or categorize tools that can be excluded from your maintenance or calibration process? Excuse me. When it comes to calibration, the tools that can be excluded from calibration are those that you don't use to measure anything. You don't use to determine conformance to specification, whether it's quantitative, in which case you get a number, or whether it's qualitative, in which case you do sort of a size measurement or sort of a go, no-go kind of thing. Anything outside of that, perhaps you have a tool that dispenses a bit of glue during assembly, an automatic glue dispenser. That's outside of calibration. Tools that are outside maintenance are a little far and few between. For example, that glue dispenser would need to be calibrated to make sure that the glue hadn't hardened inside of it, that it was dispensed routinely each time, that maybe the dispensing mechanism was operating. So when it comes to excluding tools from maintenance, that's really a very small quantity of tools. You would really have to show that a tool you're using can be excluded from maintenance proactively, perhaps in your maintenance database or some other area like that. So I hope that answers that question.
Thanks so much, Jeff. Well, ladies and gentlemen, while we're waiting for more questions to come, I want to inform all our participants that there are some more webinars that are lined up by Mr. Jeff Kassoff. You can log on to our website, which is www.globalcompliancepanel.com, to see more of the upcoming webinars. We also do have a library of past recorded versions, which is also available at our website. Now, I would like to inform all our participants that in case any of your team members, colleagues, friends might benefit from this webinar, we are happy to inform you that it would be available in the recorded format and can be purchased from our website, or you can call us at 1-800-447-9407. Hi, Jeff. I don't see any more questions coming up. Do you have any parting words, thoughts before I close today's session?
Just a general one, just to say that I hope everybody got what they looked for in this webinar, that validation is a very lengthy procedure, but validation and calibration maintenance, all of those are proactive processes that help us produce good product. We want to always want to react proactively as opposed to reactively. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Kassoff. Well, we are grateful to all of you for having taken part in today's webinar, and if you'd like to get in touch with us, you can send us an email to webinars@globalcompliancepanel.com. We welcome your suggestions and feedback or ideas on how we can improve our webinars. If you'd like to suggest a topic or desire a customized corporate training online or on-site, we ensure that whatever your training necessity is, it would be our priority. We look forward to having you with us again sometime soon, and for your continued patronage, on behalf of our presenter, Jeff Kassoff, and the Global Compliance Panel team, I'd like to thank you for participating in today's webinar, and we wish you a pleasant day ahead. Thank you.